So in this final reading group for geographical ideas, we're going to extend our exploration of critical geographies, looking at geographies of difference. Last week we looked at critical geographies in relation to Marxism explicitly, but this week, as we did in the lecture, we're looking at feminism, geographies of sexuality, and post-colonialism. In this reading group, we're looking in particular at post-colonialism, and looking at Clive Barnett's work on space, textuality and power in relation to post-colonialism, and then Knoxallow's paper, Geography is Pregnant or Geography's Milk is Flowing, from Environment and Planning D, Metaphors for a Post-Colonial Discipline. Both these authors, or sets of authors, are looking at a world beyond traditional colonialism, beyond the era of empire that we started off by looking at when we looked at Friedrich Ratzel, Environmental Determinism and Military Geopolitics, back at the beginning of this module. We're looking at a world of independence from traditional forms of empire, but also at a world in which traditional social groups, which have been silenced by the mainstream way of looking at human geography that's been by middle class, white, often male people, and looking at the world through their eyes, through science, trying to look at the world through the eyes of groups that have been silenced by that era of empire. So we're post-independence in a political sense, or post-empire or post-colonialism in a political sense, but also post-colonial in terms of these other groups are getting their voice, are getting the world as they looked at it, involved within the geographical vision and geographical imagination. So this is why, in a way, these geographies are called geographies of difference. They are involving different groups. They're looking at the different, not only the space that difference makes, but the difference that space makes within the world around us. Okay, so if we turn to some of the questions I want you to think about in relation to these papers. First of all, Clive Barnett's post-colonialism paper. According to Barnett, what is the role of culture in colonialism? Think about culture as perhaps a practice, perhaps a particular activity. How were particular activities and particular practices used by culture in order to create, maintain and perpetuate a colonial set of relationships? He uses the example of sport as perhaps one tactic, one strategy that can be used by a colonial group to subjugate its once colonized cultural groups and spaces. And what do you think about that example? What happens when the colonized group wins sporting matches, for example? Does that change the nature of the relationship? And is that a good example of a post-colonial situation? Then we move on to Frantz Fanon and his assertions about the process of development. First of all, start thinking about the relationships between the colonizer and the colonized and how that set of relationships works, according to Fanon, and then think about his critique of a notion of a linear set of development relationships. Is there a ladder to development, if you like, that everyone should pass along exactly the same routes to get to a stage of development as we describe it in the West? Or are there other processes and other ways to development that a post-colonial discourse would encourage us to think about? And then we look at the process of othering. What does othering mean? How do other groups get created? What other groups can you think of within society, and would perhaps students be considered of as an other group in some shape or form? And then perhaps think about Edward Said's notion, or the notion of discourse. How does the notion of discourse fit in with relationships of power, colonial relationships of power within this context? And how does the notion of discourse set up imaginary geographies? Geographies that perhaps don't really exist, but they do exist in our imagination. And as the insights we've seen from humanist geography, our ways of understanding the world might not be truly or objectively accurate, but nevertheless they do motivate our feelings and emotions, and therefore they're hugely important. So these are ideas of ways of thinking about the world, or might not be actually true, but might be metaphorically relevant. There is extended in the Knoxallow paper. She introduces a whole set of new metaphors for thinking about human geography in the post-colonial era that can be set in stark contrast to those metaphors, those natural science metaphors that we looked at right at the beginning of the module. So So what are the metaphors used by Knoxville et al.? How do they make us think differently about the nature of the geography? Why are these metaphors important in terms of their actual nature, in terms of their perhaps bodily, gender, sexuality, connotations, about the sorts of responses that they get from us, both intellectually but also physically? Do we respond to these metaphors in a different way than if we think of other sorts of metaphors for the notion of geography? And also, why are they important for, in general, how we consider the power of metaphor for shaping the way we think about the world? In this module, we've been thinking about the genealogy of human geography, the human geography family tree, if you like. Is that an appropriate metaphor for thinking about the range of paradigms we've looked at in this module? Are the metaphors used by Knoxville more important? Do they connect in a certain way? Do they fit together? And how effective do you think they are in changing our approach to geography? Do they make us think of the interconnections, the relationships, the sense of moral or familial responsibility for our knowledge and for that knowledge's effects in other places around the world, about our connections and responsibilities for geographically distant others? If we think about geography as a family, and geography being pregnant, then what sort of parental responsibility might we have for our knowledge and how we act in the world?